Okay, so this is a follow-up video on addressing the rear belt tension issues that are well known to the Yokomo YZ10. So I do have a previous video history on this. If you go through my older YZ10 videos, I talk about the rear belt tension issue and different ways to address it. But just to recap very briefly, there are three basic versions of the YZ10. You have the 870C, which is that guy right there. You have the Works YZ10s, which are based off the 870C, but they have some modifications. And then you have the 94 and 95 YZ10, which is more or less this platform right here. Now, for the Works YZ10s, they have a slotted mounting holes for the rear gearbox on the chassis. So you can adjust the rear belt tension on the Works model. So you don't have to worry about rear belt tension on those guys. You can address that relatively easily. So this really has more to do with the 94 and 95 YZ10 and the 870C, which have fixed mounting holes for the rear gearbox to the chassis and therefore a fixed rear belt tension. And what ends up happening is over time, the belt itself will wear in, it'll loosen up, and the belt can skip as a result of that. But even if you have a brand new belt, if the center rear drive pulley, the one that drives the rear diff, if that is worn, then even a new belt will skip on that pulley because the teeth wear in and that creates just enough play for the belt to skip over the teeth. Now, those pulleys are hard to find because they're part of this TCS unit, this slipper clutch unit. So if you want to get a new pulley, you have to find usually a whole new slipper clutch unit. And these are very rare. They're very hard to find. So you want to get as much use as you can out of that rear pulley, which basically means, increasing the rear belt tension as the pulley wears in, even if you have a as the pulley wears in, even if you have a brand new belt. Okay. So how do you do that? Well, previously I was playing with putting bearings on the top motor mount screw and overlaying that screw on top of the belt to push the belt down to increase the rear belt tension. This particular case, I have 3x7mm bearings and just a longer 3mm screw slotted in, and this works. This eliminates rear belt skipping, especially as the belt gets looser. Very good solution. However, it tends to be a little bit overkill on recovering rear belt tension. So the motor will run hotter than you would like it to. So, don't be surprised if you do this and you pull the motor off at 200 or 220 degrees. If you're willing to tolerate that, then okay. Now, this particular solution is basically the only reasonable solution for the 870C, and I'll get to why in a moment. Oops, what just happened there? Sorry about that. Okay, so on the 94 YZ10 and the 95 for that matter, what you can also do, and just to point out, this is not my idea. This was a friend of mine's idea that he put on Facebook, so he deserves credit for it. But basically, you can put shims or washers or spacers under the rear gearbox to tilt the gearbox back. And as you tilt the rear gearbox back, that increases the rear belt tension. If you tilt the rear gearbox forward for whatever stupid reason, that would loosen the rear belt tension. Okay? So what you basically do is there are 4 screws that mount the rear gearbox to the chassis, these 4 right here. You don't have to take these out entirely, you can just loosen them, but you do have to take these 2 out. And then you also undo this top screw here that connects the front belt tension adjuster to the top of the rear gearbox. Take that out, and then you just pull back on the shock tower, and that lifts the gearbox a little bit at the front to create a gap. You put a washer under there. I'm using a 1mm washer. Do it on both the left and right front mounting holes. Align it with the mounting holes, put the screws back in, and you're all set. And a 1mm spacer seems to do just enough to give a real nice rear belt tension. So if I do I'll call this the screwdriver test here, normally without this little trick, if I just press down on the belt, I would get much more deflection in the belt. I can't really make a video of the feel, but I would say that this feels certainly tighter than what it was without the 1mm spacer under these front mounting holes. And you can see this little gap right here. That came from the 1mm spacer that I put under the front of the rear gearbox. What will happen if you do that is this side of the belt the backside can rub against the rear gearbox right here. So what you will probably have to do, and I just did it on this, is just take an X-Acto knife and just try to slice out a little bit of plastic here to create a little more space for the bottom part of the belt to have clearance to the rear gearbox, because you're lifting this up, and so this clearance will decrease. So you got to cut some plastic out here. Not a big deal, pretty easy to do. So this is a really good solution. And the reason why this is probably a better solution than the bearing solution for the 94 YZ10 is not just because of the overcompensation on belt tension with the bearing solution, but also because the gearbox and the rear suspension arm mount are two separate pieces. So I can fiddle around with the angle of the rear gearbox and it will have zero impact on the rear suspension geometry. On the 870C, the rear gearbox is the same unit that the rear suspension arms mount onto. So if I tilt the rear gearbox backwards, I end up also increasing the rear anti-squat. Okay, so I cannot decouple the rear gearbox angle from the rear suspension geometry. But on the 94 and 95 YZ10, I can. They're two separate parts. So that's why on the 870C, as you can see right there, I have to use the I have to use the bearing trick. So let me put this here. Okay, so you can see here, right? I have some 3x7mm bearings on the top motor mount screw, and they're mounted over the top of the rear belt, and that pushes the belt down. This belt tension is much tighter than what it is here on the 94 with the 1mm spacers under the rear gearbox. But this, and as a result, this motor will run pretty hot. But this is the only realistic solution at your disposal if you're running an 870C and you don't have the RPM rear gearbox, which allows you to adjust belt tension in the rear, and you don't want to also, end up messing around with the rear anti-squat. So you got to use these bearings here on the 870C. Again, it works perfectly. It just makes the motor run hot. But if you're running a 94 YZ10 or a 95, I think that this 1mm shim here under the two front mounting holes for the rear gearbox are probably a much better solution. So I haven't actually tried this out on the track. I just did it here on the bench. It's better. So we will see in time, how this does on the track. This particular rear belt is already a little bit worn, so it might not save this belt, but for future belts, this is probably a pretty good thing to do. Yeah, so I think hopefully this will conclude the puzzle, so to speak, for how to fix or address the rear belt tension issue on the Yokomo YZ10. So yeah, that's it for now. Thanks for watching.